Okay, I think we'll go ahead and get started. I'm Kenna. I'm Senior Officer for Place-Based Peer Learning, and I manage this program with my colleague Sarah Harrison and Lucy Abraham Jones, who wave if you're there, Lucy and Sarah. I'm also accompanied today by two BSL interpreters, Josie, who is currently on screen, and Adrian, they will be alternating. But they're both spotlit, so you should be able to access both of them as they switch. Our speaker today is Jack Roscoe, but just before we get started, I just wanted to say that this is the second event in our new series of how-to events. These events are intended to be practical sessions that help you build skills, develop your practice, and solve issues. This session is, as you know, how to collect high quality surveys. And it is a second in a series on data and evaluation. This series is part of the Place-Based Peer Learning program, which we co-created with representatives from Creative People and Places, local cultural education partnerships, and cultural compacts. The how-to series was developed in response to a request for expert guidance in skill building and problem solving on various different topics. So we offer other event types that create space for networking and workshops that dive deeper into topics. So if you'd like to connect with anyone that you see on the session afterwards, you can do so through our networking platform, Hivebright, where you can also find information on our upcoming events and a list of attendees from this session. So I'd like to welcome our speaker for today, Jack Roscoe, who is a tech champion in data methodologies and systems for Arts Council England's Digital Culture Network. Welcome, Jack.
Hi everyone, good afternoon. Hopefully you've all made it, you're all nice and warm and you're ready to learn. So today's webinar is it's going to be, I think it'll be shorter than 90 minutes. I ran through it this morning and it's maybe a little shorter than I thought. So hopefully you can all get back to some business later on, earlier than anticipated. So can I move on? Yes. So thanks so much, Kenna, for your introduction. So I'm Jack. For those who would benefit from a visual description, I'm a white man in my early 30s. I have brown hair and glasses, and I'm wearing a sort of blue jumper today. So as Kenna mentioned, I'm a tech champion for the Digital Culture Network, and I focus on audience data collection and evaluation. For those of you who aren't aware of us, the Digital Culture Network is a free support service available to everyone in the cultural and creative sector in England. It's part of Arts Council England, and our job is to help and support the digital skills in our sector. So we have 12 tech champions who cover a range of different topics to do with digital marketing, websites, and audiences. We mainly do that with one-on-one support. It's completely free and unlimited, and I'll share some ways that you can get in touch with us at the end if that sounds like it might be useful. There's a page on our website with all of the slides from today, links to some of my articles on our Knowledge Hub, as well as a short 2-page crib sheet covering the main topics today. And you might find that useful to share with other colleagues, particularly if they're front of house and carrying out surveys to kind of cover all of the basics. So you can access that through the link on the screen, also through the QR code as well. Today's webinar will mostly cover how to plan, carry out, and collect surveys. And it's a particular focus on face-to-face surveying. So that's intended for both the people who manage surveys and also members of the team who might be doing them with visitors. So if you have staff or volunteers who are carrying out surveys, you might want to share the recording of this session with them for training purposes later. That's kind of how I've intended it. And if you don't have a venue or you're not doing physical face-to-face surveying, not everything today will be fully relevant to you, but you'll still find some useful concepts. And it might give you an idea of what's involved with face-to-face surveying if you're considering that in the future. So face-to-face surveying is generally considered to be a useful option because it generates more surveys by having interviewers approaching visitors and members of the audience. And if all goes well, it can result in higher data quality. So my background is in market research, data collection, which we sometimes call field work in the industry. I've mainly focused on cultural and creative organizations, venues, heritage and leisure attractions. I've spent about 10 years carrying out designing and working with surveys and fieldwork projects. So I have trained and managed face-to-face interviewers, both professional ones and members of staff and volunteers at organizations as well. So I'm here today to share some key concepts and best practice from the research industry. Hopefully it's useful. So today we'll cover some theory first, and then after the break, we'll talk more about the practical side of things. So what is the purpose of a survey? Why do we do it? Mainly, or one of the main reasons, is audience research. So it's to build up a picture of our current audience. It's to understand who we're reaching and who we're not reaching, to try and grow and reach new audiences. It's also to evaluate what we do. So it's asking what people thought of us, finding out what we're doing well, what we could be doing better, and helping us make decisions and focus limited resources. So it's all about learning from what we do and kind of applying those findings as we go. And that's generally called evaluation. These are two of the reasons that funders often require surveys as part of funded projects. It's to understand the impact and reach of those projects and the public or private money that's going into them. It's to understand the benefits to the audiences, but also the practitioners and the people working in the sector, to understand the skills and the learning that they're developing by being involved. But the biggest challenge is often deciding what to focus on. If you are doing surveying already, or you're thinking about surveying in the future, it'd be lovely if you just popped a message into the chat just so we can kind of see what you would like to focus on, what you'd like to find out, and what you're working on. It would be really helpful. I'm not sure why, but I've ended up with a sort of nautical theme for the pictures in today's presentation. It just kind of works, but there is a random octopus at the end. So apologies if anyone feels a bit seasick today. To help you understand what's most important to ask about in a survey, I want to just step back to think about your organization with a sort of big picture view. So there's three main levels to your organization and its strategy. The cause is what makes us who we are as an organization. It's the mission that we have. It's what we exist to bring to the world. It's the outcomes and impacts that we have when we reach people. For example, with the Digital Culture Network that I'm part of, it's to increase and develop the digital skills and maturity of the sector. The vision is how we do that. It's our broad goals. It's the high-level program of work. It's our activities and our outputs. For example, at the DCN, we have tech champions who provide one-to-one support, deliver events and training, and develop partnerships with other organizations in the sector. The strategy is how we work on a day-to-day level. It's the specific activities that we're doing, our sort of planned program of work, and who those activities sit with and who's responsible for them. We identify clear areas of focus and priority. So again, with the DCN, it's working directly on those support cases. It's using Arts Council England programs and priorities to understand how to target our support for maximum impact. And it's evaluating our work as we go along to make sure that we're having an impact and that we're pitching our support at the right level for people who we engage with. So the reason I spoke about all of that, seems a bit of a non sequitur, is because we use it to establish which data points or impacts that we should be measuring and look at. We can tie questions to specific objectives or impacts. And those are, when we identify those, we sometimes call them key performance indicators, or the dreaded KPIs that you probably speak to your manager about. So surveys can also provide you with additional data to supplement existing data that you already have in your organization. Things like numbers of ticket sales, newsletter subscriptions, website views, and social media analytics. Ideally, if you can find out something without having to include it in your survey, that's better. It keeps it nice and short and focused. It's also about monitoring and measuring change over time, evaluating what you've been doing so you can see how your strategy is working in practice. You can look at the specific things that you do in those specific measures, and then you can move back up to your sort of overall cause and vision to make sure you're delivering it. It can also feed into the planning, the operational side of your activities, programming, marketing, and front of house especially. The idea is that the knowledge that you gain from your survey would be shared across the whole organization, and it would be discussed by everyone, and you all reflect on the findings together and kind of use it in your day-to-day work. So everyone sees the results and is able to apply them and act on them. So we'll move on to some key research concepts now, and I'll try not to go too quickly because I have a danger of waffling and or speeding through it. I can never find the right level. So in research, we often talk about sampling. Sampling means making sure that your data is representative of your audience. You can't speak to everybody, but we want our survey sample to be structured in such a way that it maps closely onto the real audience, and we represent them as accurately as we can. When we talk about sample size, we mean the number of surveys that we collect. So why is that important? Well, the more surveys we have, the more confidence we can have in our data, and that any trends that we identify in the data are statistically significant. I knew I would trip over that. It also means being able to look at subgroups within the survey sample. For example, having enough surveys to look specifically at young people or certain visitor groups, maybe visitors with disabilities or other key sectors for your program. Let's look at some different sample sizes on the next slide. Now, apologies for this. There's a lot to look at, but it will start to make sense as I talk you through it. So I've taken this table from the Illuminate survey targets. Originally, larger sample size targets, which you can see on the right, were suggested as survey targets for organizations. Arts Council got a lot of feedback about how difficult it would be for some organizations to achieve such large numbers of surveys. So a lower minimum survey target was published as a lower threshold, which you can see in bold text on the left. So if we achieve a particular number of surveys, this table shows us how accurate the data is. We measure accuracy in statistics with something called the margin of error. So that's expressed as a percentage. A 5% margin of error means the real answer to a question that we get in our survey results could be anywhere 5% higher than or 5% lower than our result. So if 50% of people said they liked our exhibition, with a 5% margin of error, the real answer could be as high as 55% or as low as 45%. The table shows us the margins of error for different audience sizes and numbers of surveys. More surveys means a lower margin of error. For example, you can see on the top row that collecting 40 surveys means a 15% margin of error, but collecting 100 surveys would reduce the margin of error to 10%. The effect on the margin of error is more dramatic on the lower survey numbers towards the top of the table. So going from 15 to 10% is really significant and massively improves the quality of your data, whereas it might be less significant going from 3% to 2% at the bottom of the table. However, I should say bigger sample sizes are always better for a few reasons. Firstly, the data will be more representative in general. Secondly, because smaller differences in the survey responses can be flagged as being significant. What do I mean by that? Let's say that 4% of people liked your exhibition, more liked it this year versus last year. But if you had a 5% margin of error, you're not sure if that's a real change or it's just a fluctuation that's part of the margin of error. So having a lower margin of error lets you look at more tiny changes and be sure that they're real. As I mentioned on the previous slide, it makes it possible to analyze smaller groups within the data more accurately. So if only some of your survey responses are from your regular audience or young people or diverse groups of audiences, and you want to look at their answers separately, then you need enough surveys to be able to do that accurately. So I hope that all makes sense. I was very scared of that slide. Firstly, we want to think about how to structure our sample. We want it to proportionally represent our whole audience. So I've used a fancy term here, stratified sampling. What do I mean by that? I mean like the strata of a rock, or maybe more like an ice cream sundae, the different layers. We want to sample in a way that reflects all of the layers of people and activities. we want to collect surveys in proportion to different audience sizes. So thinking about our different programming and events, keeping surveys in proportion to number of visitors. As an example, if one event was 10 times more popular than another event, you would want to collect 10 times more surveys at the more popular event. You can't always predict visitor numbers in advance, but you could use previous year's visitor data or make some guesses about which programming is likely to be more or less popular. Scott, I've seen your question there. Maybe we can come on to that at the end. That's I spend a lot of time talking about that. The profile of visitors might be different on weekends and weekdays. Different times of day and evening get different visitors. So, for example, there may be more or fewer working people or families attending at different times of day or on weekends and weekdays. The key is to survey across a spread of days and times and think about the school holidays as well, because they will be massively different. The starting point, I usually suggest 60% of surveys to be collected on weekdays and about 40% on weekends, but that can vary depending on your visitor patterns. We also need to consider how we recruit our survey respondents. Some approaches, like emails, comment cards, or a survey on a kiosk, you might find people are more or less likely to take part and self-select in using those methods. It might be people who have very strong opinions. Maybe they hated the experience, or maybe they really love you as an organization and they want to feed back and tell you about that. It can also be to do with demographics, things like gender, age, social background, and the familiarity with your offer and general cultural participation. Those things can make a difference of whether people feel comfortable or see the value in selecting themselves to take research. So a face-to-face approach, having a person making an appeal, does help with that. But it can also lead to something called approach bias. That's when people or interviewers unconsciously approach certain types of people more or less. Maybe it's people they think look nice and they like the look of and would be likely to stop. Or maybe they avoid families with young children who they know are less likely to stop. In some cases, we've seen interviewers try to help by overrepresenting certain groups of the audience, making sure that they approach disabled visitors every time, or people from global majority ethnic backgrounds, to make sure their voices are heard. But if that's done too much, then it skews the data and it makes it unrepresentative of the real picture. So we need a randomized approach, a scientific method. The usual way that we do this is a counting method. And it's going to sound very silly, but it does work, I promise you. We choose a number based on how busy it is. So in this case, I've chosen 3. We draw an imaginary square on the ground near the exit, count to 3, that's people, and approach the third person. Even if they're within a group, you want to specifically reach that person. You can explain what you're doing to them. It is weird, but you can say, I know it sounds stupid, but I'm counting people at random to select them and make sure it's a random choice. I'm very sorry. But it has a huge effect on the data and I really recommend it. It's noticeable when interviewers don't do that they always seem to approach the same type of people. So we're about to go on our break. I'll just list what we've covered so far. The purpose of the survey, cause, vision, and strategy, and how that fits into the types of questions that are asked and how it's used. Sampling, so the survey targets and how we arrive at a sample size. Sampling across different days and performances. Randomized approaches to sample people. And then we'll go to our break now and we'll cover the interviewer training side and the practicalities of it afterwards. So we'll take 5 minutes. I've gone through that a little quicker than I thought, but it's a chance to reflect back on what you've heard, maybe think of some questions, stretch your legs, get a drink, rest your eyes. So it's now 2:52. Let's come back at 2:57 and we'll see you there. So it's interesting to see some of the messages in the chat as well, people coming at this from different sort of levels of skill and having different problems with research and with surveying. So I'm really interested to explore that later. Okay, so we've just ticked over to 2:57. Let's carry on. So finally, we'll move on to how to interview in person. And this is the practical side for interviewers approaching members of the public. So approaching people is what most people find the scariest part of this process at first. And you'll probably find it difficult if you've never done it before as well. It does get easier, and you will get more confident the more of it that you do. It also helps to be really familiar with the survey so that you know you won't get lost or stuck with it, and it will flow well. You can try role-playing it with other people first to get more comfortable working with the survey. So most people, unfortunately, won't jump at the chance to be surveyed, but generally people are friendly and they will help if you ask them nicely. There's no magic phrase or technique, but being yourself, it helps to make a connection. You want to make sure that you don't sound like you're reading a script, but you don't want to go too far the other way and sound overly chatty and friendly. I always think of the people on the high street who approach you to sign you up to charities, and they're so cheerful, and they start with, "Hey, how are you today?" And it can come across as really false. So get right into it and just say what you're doing, and be natural. You're overcoming people's automatic response. They want to leave and you're in the way. So be honest with them, telling them that you really need people to stop and help. It helps you out on the day. It helps your organization, and force them to think about you with some empathy, and that will overcome that automatic response. In general, about 25% of people will stop for a good interviewer. So you will find you're rejected fairly often, but that's okay. You can also explain how it helps your organization grow and develop. You can also try the nuclear option. You can say you have to collect the surveys for your funding so that you can stay open and keep putting on work. People might not realize that. So all you need to do is say hi, explain that you need people to help with a survey, and ask them if they'd like to help you out. Where it goes from there does depend on how they reply. If they say yes, great, you're in. If they're not sure, you might need to win them over. So I find it's useful to pair a negative with a positive. Yes, the survey will take you 7 or 8 minutes, but we really need it because it helps us understand how to do better and it keeps our funders happy. But don't go overboard on this or spend too long trying to win people over. If they just say no and flat out refuse, don't push it. It can look a bit desperate. And if you're too persistent, that will not reflect well on people's visit experience. And an unwilling respondent is never good. They won't engage with the questionnaire fully. So I would avoid that. If you are refused, it's good to be graceful in defeat. So remain polite and professional. You can just say a quick, "No problem, see you later." Just be quick and genuine and try to avoid sounding negative or passive aggressive. I've always found that being passionate and friendly makes a big difference, and people can actually enjoy chatting to you. They might not enjoy the survey questions, but they might enjoy speaking to another person for a bit. So when I was an interviewer, I didn't do anything particularly special besides being a good listener and just cracking the occasional joke. But people would often say that talking to me was one of the best parts of their visit. So it can make a huge difference to people and it can brighten the day. There's a couple of initial practical things to consider when you're surveying, especially if you're using a tablet. You need to think about people's accessibility needs. What adjustments might be necessary for some visitors or audiences? Is there any additional support that they might need? Can they see or read the screen? The questions and the way that they're presented, will that present a barrier for people taking part? There's no one-size-fits-all approach, but you obviously want to make sure nobody misses the chance to feed back to you. It can sometimes help make people more comfortable if you offer them a seat, but I would make the survey length clear to them, because offering someone a seat can also make them think that they're going to be stuck with you for ages. So you just need to balance that. You want to make sure that you're prepared for your shift. So make sure that your tablet is charged up, you've got Wi-Fi, and the survey is ready to go to prevent any awkwardness when you start if someone agrees to take part. Direct sunlight often makes things very difficult as well. On the screen of a lot of tablets, it can wash out or cause glare and make it hard to see the questions on the screen. So especially with the low winter sun that we have at the moment, you might need to find a shady spot to take the survey. During the survey, it's also important to explain and show how to answer each question. Give people the context. People will sometimes not see how they're supposed to answer the question and give you the wrong kind of answer. Maybe they launch into a sort of story about their day when the question was very specific. So it's fine to show the screen, and it can be useful for long lists so that people can navigate and see what options are available. So here is the octopus. I want you to think about avoiding having any effect on the data as an interviewer. There are a few ways that people can be biased in the way that they answer questions, and this also applies to online surveys as well. It's not always the case, but these biases can have an effect. Agreement or acquiescence bias means people are more likely to select a positive answer and strongly agree, or rate things as excellent. You can remind people that it's okay not to like everything. To give you the good and the bad is really useful. Sometimes when we're designing a survey, we put the list the wrong way round, and we have negative answers at the top. Primacy bias is a bias towards the first or the top items in a list. Some surveys will fix this by randomizing the order every time. You can also help by making sure that you point people to the other items in the list. Make sure they sort of read the whole thing first. You want to avoid leading people. So leading is when the things that you say or that you do lead people to answer in a certain way. For example, the language that you use can be important. Neutral language is essential. Making sure that you read questions and answers in that neutral way and without paraphrasing. As an example, an interviewer might say, "Did you have a good time today?" And that might be leading. It expects a positive answer. Whereas, "How would you rate today's visit?" is more boring, but it's more neutral. Tone of voice can also have a major effect. When using answer options and scales, to give a slightly hammy example, you might say, "Excellent, good, neutral, poor, very poor." And the tone of the voice and even your facial expressions might affect how those possible answers are perceived. Part of being a good interviewer is to build a connection with your respondent during the survey. It's not as hard as it sounds. Being friendly and showing that you're listening is really important. Give them space to express themselves. You can be friendly and chat to them if that's your style. That's fine. The risk of leading the answer is lower on questions of fact. So things that are just true. What they saw today, have they visited before? You can't really lead someone to give a wrong answer to that. But a higher risk of leading is when asking them for the opinion or on personal topics. Your phrasing and tone might affect whether they're comfortable answering a question or force them to answer in a certain way. The sort of elite SAS level of interviewing is controlling your reactions. It's hard to resist the urge to comment. For example, "Oh, I love that exhibition too. I agree." Or, I didn't like that exhibition. That didn't work for me." I also think the social context is important. Some audiences may be more or less comfortable expressing themselves about arts and culture. And if you sound like you're talking on a different level to them, it might change what they want to say and how comfortable they feel expressing themselves. By agreeing or disagreeing or commenting with another concept, you might be creating a sort of social pressure. Agreeing and reinforcing what they say suggests what you want to hear, and offering a different or challenging view might shut them down. Mirroring is when people adjust what they say, their tone and their body language to match other people. It's a trick to make other people more comfortable around us. So it happens subconsciously. Think about your tone of voice, your body language, and maybe when you fold your arms, how it has an effect on other people. In research, it's most often about tone and emotion. If you come on too strong, then that might affect their answers as they mirror you. Or you might mirror the person you're speaking to and reinforce or bring out a stronger response than they really feel. You can show that you're listening and that you care, but do it in a neutral way. So saying, okay, or thanks. Surveys often include sections of personal questions to find out about audience demographics. We've had some questions about Illuminate as well, for example. So funders, including Arts Council England, are now asking demographic questions in more depth than previously may have been the case, and asking about topics and things that might not have been talked about openly in the past, or that might require more sensitivity. If a survey features personal questions that might be delicate, you can set the expectations going into the survey. You could say, I'm afraid it's going to ask quite a few personal questions about you, but you can skip any of them if you don't want to answer. These questions might also feel less relevant to your visitors and their visit, and they could find it confusing why you're asking them about themselves rather than about the work that they've seen. So it helps to be able to explain and articulate why those questions are asked. Firstly, it helps your organization understand the audience, who's currently visiting and who's not. As well as being useful for your organization, funders use the data to see the reach and impact of public money, especially if it's public funding. The main goal for funders is often to get more culture and creativity into places and into communities where people don't have as much access to it. And that's especially true here on the place-based learning platform, where we're working on building up the cultural offer and infrastructure in specific places. So data is the main way to track this, and surveys are the most direct way to find out who's taking part. So putting all of that together, you could say to a respondent, I know this might not seem very relevant for us to ask, but it helps to understand how well we're doing attracting different kinds of people at different ages, social or cultural background, and we can see if anyone's missing out. And it helps us bring in new audiences and secure funding so we can keep doing more and better work in the future. So that is all of my content for the day. If I was doing an in-person training session, at this point, I would pair everyone up and force them to do surveys on each other. But I don't have that luxury today. It might be something to think about if you are watching this as a training resource. Maybe could you do that with someone else? So thinking about the concepts today, in the second half, approaching people and being more natural and straightforward, reading out the questions carefully and avoiding any leading or bias, and being able to articulate the purpose of the research and being sensitive to the needs of people. Before we move on to the Q&A, as I mentioned at the start, we offer free one-to-one support on this and many other topics at the Digital Culture Network. If you think yourself or a colleague might benefit from that, or you just want to talk to someone, or check out our resources and past webinars on our Knowledge Hub, these are the links you can follow to access our support. I'll move into the Q&A now. So I will click there. And would you like to come back in, Kenna?
Sure. Thank you, Jack. That was really, really interesting. I just have one question just to get us started. How would you kind of translate some of the suggestions that you've made to kind of online and surveys where you may not be able to ask people all of the questions in person? Maybe you're handing out iPads or directing people to survey stations or sending follow-up online surveys. What suggestions might you have for those?
So I think you can still have human language when you get people to participate. I think if you have a person directing people to, like you said, QR codes or self-completion on tablets, you can do all of the same tricks of sort of explain why it's useful, like why it matters. It's much harder in emails and in that sort of situation where we're bombarded with information that everyone's trying to get us to buy something or look at something. So for that particular avenue, I go nuclear and, you know, try to really grab people's attention and sort of stop them, you know, some kind of copy or something really punchy that's going to make people pay attention, and then explain and give a call to action why the survey helps. It is not easy. And you kind of have to be radical about it, like just leaving QR codes on posters around the building. You won't find people will necessarily just take part of their own accord usually. But the language can also feed into the survey itself. So the way that you write the questions and the text that you have in during the survey. I don't know if I'm a bit odd, but I like to kind of be funny with that text, and I like to be sort of, you know, keep people engaged and reassure them, you know, like tell them at points in the survey how it's helping and how far they've got left, and not to worry.
Sure, thank you. If you have questions for Jack, please put them in the chat or raise your hand, and I will call on you. Jack, would you mind stop your screen sharing so I can see everybody? We can see everybody. Thank you. Please raise your hand if you have any questions. There's a chat comment here about how to make people feel like it's worth filling out evaluation data. I've had the experience of offering small like postcards from museum collections as incentives. What other things might you suggest?
Yeah, there's a lot of thinking about this. Some people are of the opinion that people who want to take the survey will take it, and people who don't won't. And incentives don't always make a huge difference to that. There are incentives that you can use. One that I really like is saying we'll donate 50p to charity for every survey that's completed. That feels nice, and it feels like it's more manageable. You're not having to collect people's email addresses for a prize draw or any of those other things. Cash incentives can work, but depending on the situation, people might be just doing the survey to get the cash and they don't really care about the feedback. I don't know. Sometimes that feels like the way. I've seen other examples where one organization was giving out samosas as an incentive, which is quite a nice idea. I feel like there would be a huge queue for that. And people, again, maybe not that bothered about the survey, maybe more bothered about the samosas. So I think besides incentives, you do have to think about that there has to be something in it for the respondent. They have to get a fuzzy feeling that they've helped with something. They have to maybe be thanked. They have to be told what it's contributing to, what the benefits are. And so maybe they can visualize then you doing more work in future and continuing to exist, or you becoming a better and more powerful organization, or your community kind of becoming stronger. Maybe all of those concepts are things you can kind of reference.
Thank you. That's really helpful. There's a question in the chat from Scott about Illuminate surveys and questions about demographic information. I think we all struggle to collect demographic information. And so questions like, what's the difference between sex and gender? Did I already answer that? How people, to help people understand the kind of differences in the demographic information and why we need to collect that information?
That would put me on the back foot as well. So having not thought about that before, I'm now really struggling to sort of think of a good answer to that. So that's a really good point. Maybe that's something to kind of have in the guidance when you're kind of surveying, to know how you answer your questions about the questions like that. Yeah, I think maybe it's a case of sort of being polite, but sort of saying, you know, kind of breezy about it, like, oh no, it's a different concept because, you know, sex and gender are kind of considered different concepts, and people can identify with gender, and sex is maybe a bit more fluid now. So those three questions, maybe it's just about sort of being breezy with people, but being sensitive to why those questions matter, and maybe finding the language to articulate that feels right. Because again, it can feel like you're reading off a script sometimes, and I think people really value a connection with you and you engaging with them. That's a non-answer to that question. I'm very sorry.
Um, Thank you. It's a difficult question to answer. I will also say that there's other help with Elluminate. So the Arts Council is offering specific sessions on Elluminate. You can also reach out to your relationship manager, or also PricewaterhouseCoopers offers help directly on Elluminate. So that may be, if you have other questions about that, maybe a better place to get clearer answers. Any other questions?
Yeah, and on that, Kenna, I believe the guidance is being completely overhauled in response to a lot of the feedback. So I think that will get more developed and more useful as time goes by. Sorry, Katie, you're welcome to.
Oh, thank you. That was so interesting. Thank you so much. I guess my question is probably a bit of a how long is a piece of string question. But is there a kind of magic length of time or magic number of questions to kind of go for of like kind of stopping people on the street type of survey?
Yeah, it really depends on the context. So stopping people on a high street, 5 minutes is ideal. Anything longer than that is going to be, an ask for people. It varies by person. Maybe if people are sat down, they might tolerate a longer survey. In a really relaxed, I had the luxury of working in Tate Liverpool a few years ago, a really relaxed kind of lobby, people really happy to be there. I had a 10-minute survey and that was no problem because people wanted to talk about the work and they were happy to do that. So it's understanding the context of where people will be in their minds and kind of what's appropriate. But a shorter survey is always better. Not just because it helps you get more of them and convince more people to take part, but people give better answers to shorter surveys. At a certain point, they kind of stop thinking and they start rating everything the same, after that sort of, especially after the 10-minute mark, but maybe even before that.
Thank you.
Yeah, that's right. Keeping them short will increase the quality of your survey data for sure, making it more statistically significant. I've definitely done surveys that are way too long. Any other questions? There was a question earlier about being efficient with the surveys. Stella, I was wondering if you could share what you kind of meant by that.
Sorry, did you say mine? What I meant by my question is what you
I
asked.
was wondering what you meant by being more efficient with the survey collection. Is that about the time spent or
I mean, it's partly about the kind of kind of figuring out how we collect our surveys kind of when we're there, but also which staff would be doing it if we need volunteers, and kind of how much we would have to train them up. But then also sometimes kind of finding the right form to do it, so digital or on paper, and also sometimes kind of finding the right question so that people actually feel like they can fill it in. Because that second part of my question was about kind of how do people actually feel like it's worth their time, because a lot of people just want to run off after an event and we're like, no, wait, we need the evaluations. But then it's like, how do we actually convince them that this is really important? And there's obviously the standard line of saying like, if you fill this in for us, it really helps us show impact and that helps us to get more funding and do more of this. But that's not always enough to sell it to them, I find. So handing out postcards was a nice idea, but that's something that's been on my mind a lot, and to kind of get a more efficient response rate, I guess, but also for our team to make it more efficient for a team to be there and get the most out of that.
Yeah, so I think I could spend about half an hour answering that question, which I'll try not to do. So I think, yes, there are different methods, and they may be more or less appropriate in different situations. And post like when people are rushing to kind of get out and get public transport or get home, is really difficult. And that's why touring organizations really struggle when they don't have access to email contact lists to send an emailed survey out. I think in that situation, there's some really interesting stuff about maybe turning it more into a sort of post-show discussion, like a chance to kind of, and maybe a survey isn't the appropriate way to do this because that's just filling in a form. But some organizations will kind of invite members of the audience to sit down and talk about the work, but that's kind of done in a sort of evaluation-y sort of way as well. Like, maybe you transcribe that conversation or you sort of take notes and you get evaluation-y sort of insight out of that. Some things that you need to know are statistical, they are quantitative, and that might be best in a survey. And maybe that's keeping that stuff really short in a quantitative survey, but having other methods and other engagements with the audience where you explore the other things that you can do in a more creative way or in a more sort of conversational way, and do it that way. So understanding kind of all of the different research objectives that you might have, and which ones you can pull out, which ones have to be in the survey and which ones you could do in other ways. But yeah, it's challenging for sure.
It makes sense. And maybe just a quick follow-up, because as you were talking, I was also thinking like one of the challenges I think we specifically have in our borough is that it's the most diverse borough in the UK. So we have a lot of people who don't speak English. And so often when we come out with our surveys in English, a lot of kind of groups will just kind of point at one person of like, she speaks English, let her fill it out for all of us. And that obviously doesn't really get us a good response rate. So it's sometimes also, I kind of wonder, like, how can we make that easy for people without really needing to use language, or having people there who can help them fill it out somehow, but how can that be more efficient as well?
Yeah, and that's really, it sounds like self-selection as well, doesn't it? Like the English speaker in the group may have gotten a different experience from what they saw than non-English speakers as well. So in that situation, I might be thinking about really simple translated survey forms. Again, if the population is incredibly diverse and there's lots of different languages being spoken, becomes a challenge as well. But if there are specific groups that are fairly common in your area and specific languages, maybe a really simple short survey that could be translated into those languages could be useful. I'm sure that's something you've thought about. That's a hard one.
Yeah, and it's a kind of, that was the solution I think for a long time, but then Illuminate came and it's a standard survey that we have to do in exactly that way. And I'm like, actually rephrasing the questions into simpler English now, or making the questionnaire shorter, because indeed people don't have that kind of attention span, has become a lot harder since Illuminate. So that's like, those questions have kind of come up again in our team when we thought that we had kind of solved them. But yeah, I don't want to go into a discussion just about this, but it's a lot of stuff that we're thinking about.
Yeah, and I think there's definitely I mean, I can't speak for them because I'm in a sort of separate team, but there's definitely a recognition in the kind of the Illuminate part of Arts Council and the wider Arts Council that there are challenges in certain situations with the tool, with the survey. And there's a real recognition that for some organizations, those challenges are really difficult, and we won't necessarily just expect that targets will be hit and you'll do everything to do that. It will probably be more of a conversation, but I can't represent them fully and all of that sort of side of it. But I know that there is an awareness of how difficult it is in some situations.
Thank you. Any other questions for Jack? No?
I'm searching my brain to see if there's anything that I've forgotten to say, but there's probably enough, isn't it?
I was thinking about sampling. So if, you talked a bit about, making sure that you don't target certain people or avoid others. I've done sampling where, it's like the every fifth person to walk through past a certain point. Do you have any other like thoughts on kind of the sampling within a crowd, maybe in a crowd or a space where there isn't a specific doorway where everybody has to come through? What would you suggest?
I'd still apply the same principle. So I think it has to be that kind of counting method. Otherwise, that's the only way to really select people, as a person trying to get other people to take part. It's finding a way to fit that to the situation, I think. I can't think of another way.
Thank you. So if there's no further questions, we will go ahead and wrap up today. We hope to see you at our next event. I have a couple of slides just to share with our upcoming events. So we have, hold on. We have a Connect and Reflect event next week on community-led evaluation. There's no speaker at Connect and Reflect events, but it's an opportunity for you to chat to each other and share your learnings in a kind of just a lunchtime chat situation, very informal. And then we have another how to collect data in our data series, how to collect data in a public space. Also led by Jack, and that will be on the 11th of December at 2:30. We hope to see you. We'll share there's a QR code here where you can register for events, and we'll also share the link in the chat.
Can I also plug my webinar for next week? I'm very busy for some reason. I have so via the proper sort of digital culture network where I spend most of my time. I have an introductory webinar next week on Wednesday, so similar time, to audience research in general, and it's more about the design and maybe thinking about potential audiences as well. So it's quite different to some of the stuff we've talked about today. So if you go on the Digital Culture Network website, you can find that one.
Thank you. I will also be posting a link to that event on our Hivebright. So if you would like to register, I'll be sharing that.
Great. Thanks, Kenna.
Thanks, everyone. See you next.
Thank you.